I took the same ride every month with the same driver, never spoke a word until the day I told him it would be my last trip. And it changed everything. I never planned to notice him. He was just a driver. A face I saw once a month from the passenger seat, same car, same quiet radio, same route. I always sat in the back right seat and always looked out the window. It started a year ago. I requested a ride at exactly 8:40 p.m. He accepted within seconds. When the car arrived, he nodded once in the mirror and said my destination out loud just to confirm it. I said yes. That was the last word I spoke to him for 11 months. Every month after that, I requested the same ride at the same time. Somehow it was always him. Same nod, same question, same silence. I didn't do it on purpose at first. It just became easier to sit in a car where no one asked how I was, where no one expected me to explain myself. The city lights passed by and I could pretend I was invisible. I noticed small things. The way he kept the car clean. The way he adjusted the mirror before every drive. The way he never checked his phone when the car was moving. He never tried to talk. He never tried to fill the quiet. That mattered more than he knew. The destination never changed. A small clinic at the edge of the city. I always got out quickly and never looked back. On the 12th month, I almost canceled. My hand hovered over the screen longer than usual. But habit won. I requested the ride. When he arrived, something felt heavier. The air, the silence. I knew before I got in that this would be the last time. We drove the same streets, passed the same bakery, stopped at the same red light near the bridge. My heart beat louder with every block. Halfway there, I finally spoke. This is my last trip. The car slowed slightly, not enough to stop, just enough to tell me he heard me. He asked why. I stared at my reflection in the window. I told him because some journeys aren't meant to be repeated forever. Because I wouldn't need the clinic anymore. Because endings deserve witnesses. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked if I was okay. I almost laughed. I said I would be. The car stopped at the curb. I reached for the door. Before I got out, he said something he had never said before. I'm glad it was me. I looked at him then. Really looked. And for the first time, I wondered what silence had cost us both. Would you have spoken sooner? Or stayed silent till the end? I didn't walk into the clinic right away. I stood on the sidewalk pretending to look for something in my bag while the car idled behind me. I could feel his eyes on my back through the mirror, and it made my chest tighten in a way I wasn't prepared for. I turned around. He rolled down the window halfway. The city noise slipped in between us. He asked if I wanted him to wait. I shook my head at first. Waiting felt like hope, and hope felt dangerous. But then he added something softer. Just in case. I nodded. I sat on the low wall outside the building while the minutes passed. The clinic lights hummed. People came and went. I watched his car in the reflection of the glass door like it might disappear if I blinked. After a while, I returned to the car, the decision I'd been holding for months pressed against my ribs. I told him the truth. I told him that once a month I came here to sit with my mother for an hour while she slowly forgot who I was. I told him that the doctor said the next stage would be worse, and that today was the day I signed the papers to move her somewhere closer to my home. Somewhere I could visit without pretending I was strong. I told him that the rides were the only place I didn't have to perform, where I could just exist. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer sympathy wrapped in empty words. He said he was sorry. Only once. And it was enough. We sat there longer than necessary, the meter still running. Neither of us caring. When I finally got out, I didn't rush. I closed the door gently like I might want to open it again. He asked if this really was the last ride. I said I didn't know. He nodded like he understood uncertainty better than most. Before driving away, he said if I ever needed a ride again at 8:40 p.m., I could request one, and maybe it would be him. Maybe not, but he hoped it would be. I watched the car disappear into traffic and realized something important. Silence can be a choice, and so can connection. I walked home feeling lighter and heavier at the same time, knowing that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone see you just once. Would you open up to a stranger if it felt safe enough? I walked home under streetlights feeling both emptied and strangely full, as if something quiet had shifted inside me during that ride, and refused to settle back into place the way it always had after previous visits to the clinic, where memories waited and patience felt heavier than grief tonight. I tried to tell myself it was over, that routines would change and time would smooth the sharp edges, but my body kept the calendar marking days until the next 8th of the month without asking permission, as if hope had learned my habits and waited quietly again tonight alone. Weeks passed and I focused on practical things, packing my mother's apartment, choosing labels, scheduling help, learning how to repeat my name without breaking when she asked who I was. For the third time each visit teaching me, endurance, patience, grief, love, tangled together until silence felt kind again somehow. One evening, my phone buzzed at 8:39, and my breath caught before I could think, because the app suggested a ride automatically remembering me better than I remembered myself lately. I stared at the screen, listening to traffic outside, wondering if coincidence could feel like invitation or warning tonight again. I requested the ride and waited under the awning, feeling foolish and hopeful, in equal measure telling myself it would not be him, and that would be easier. The car arrived quietly. Familiar clean mirror adjusted once my heart answered before my head could argue otherwise, again softly tonight alone. He greeted me the same way, a nod. The destination spoken softly, nothing more yet. Something in his voice acknowledged choice rather than habit. This time the door closed, the meter started, and silence settled like an agreement. We had both finally read clearly together tonight at last, again quietly. We drove without hurry, and I watched the city breathe past us, thinking how strange it was that safety had found me through repetition and restraint. I spoke then, not a confession, but a question, asking if he ever waited for anything without knowing why and fearing hope might answer. He considered before replying that driving taught him patience and that some passengers return until they no longer need the road. He listens for that moment. I nodded, understanding how care can look like distance until it doesn't anymore. The car moved on and I felt braver for speaking once. When we reached my building, I hesitated, then asked if he would take the long way next time if there was one. He smiled in the mirror, said he would drive wherever I asked as long as I asked, and something warm settled between us, not a promise, just possibility. I stepped out, thanked him, and watched the car leave, knowing I had crossed a line toward living, and that felt right tonight. The calendar shifted quietly, and for the first time, I didn't dread it. I welcomed the road ahead, uncertain, human, open, and mine to choose freely now. Would you risk changing the routine if it meant feeling alive again? The next month arrived faster than I expected, like time had been leaning forward instead of dragging its feet, and when the 8th appeared on my calendar, I didn't feel the familiar knot of dread. I felt something closer to anticipation, which surprised me enough to sit with it quietly before acting. At 8:40 p.m., I requested the ride without hesitation. He arrived within seconds. This time, I sat in the front passenger seat, not as a statement, just as a choice, and he noticed because he paused briefly before starting the car, like he was recalibrating the shape of the evening. He asked if the destination was the same. I shook my head. I gave him a different address, my apartment across town, a place I had never taken him before, a place that belonged to the present instead of the past. He nodded and pulled into traffic without comment. The city looked different from the front seat, brighter, closer, less, like something passing by and more like something I was inside of, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, letting that shift settle naturally between us. Halfway through the drive, he asked how my mother was doing. The question was gentle, not prying, and I realized he remembered without trying. I told him she moved into the new place, and that some days she smiled at me like she knew me, and some days she didn't, and both versions hurt in different ways, but at least now I could visit without pretending the pain wasn't there. He said that sounded like courage. I laughed quietly because courage never felt like this. It felt messy, uncertain, unfinished, but I appreciated that he saw strength where I only felt tired. We stopped at a red light, and he admitted something in a low voice that surprised me. He said he had wondered if I would ever get back in his car again, and that he had checked his app on the 8th out of habit, even when he told himself not to. I looked at him, then really looked, and saw someone who had learned how to wait without asking anything in return. That mattered. When we reached my building, I didn't rush out. I asked him if he ever told his passengers about his life. He smiled and said, rarely, because driving was easier when he didn't carry too many stories. I told him maybe some stories wanted to be carried even briefly. He considered that, then nodded. I opened the door, and before stepping out, I said I was glad I changed the destination. He said so was he. As I walked inside, I felt lighter, not because my life had changed dramatically, but because I had allowed it to shift slightly, and sometimes that is enough. Upstairs, I sat by the window watching traffic move like veins of light and realized something simple and powerful. I wasn't counting rides anymore. I was counting moments, and that felt like progress. Do small changes ever end up meaning the most? The following month, I debated canceling the ride entirely, telling myself that maybe some habits were meant to fade instead of continuing, but the truth was, I missed the quiet presence, the way he drove as if the car had memory, as if it remembered me sitting in the same seat 12 times before, silent, watching the city blur past, and I realized I wanted that again, not because of the destination, not because of the clinic, but because of the comfort I had never named. At exactly 8:40 p.m., I requested the ride and waited outside, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves mingled with curiosity, wondering if he would remember that I had sat up front last month, wondering if he noticed the little changes I hadn't noticed in myself, like how my hands didn't tremble as much, or how I carried my thoughts with less urgency, as if patience had quietly settled inside me during the months I'd been away. He arrived almost instantly, the car shining under the streetlights, engine humming softly, and when I got in, he didn't ask if the destination was the same. He just started the car, like he already knew, and the quiet between us felt alive rather than empty, a shared understanding we hadn't needed words to create, and I let it wash over me as the city rolled past, the traffic lights pulsing gently like a heartbeat. Halfway through the drive, I found myself speaking before I could stop myself, telling him about the small victories with my mother, how she laughed at a joke I made even if she didn't remember the punchline, how she recognized me in moments fleeting and fragile, and I watched his eyes in the mirror, catching a flicker of something I couldn't name. Maybe recognition, maybe empathy, maybe a careful hope, and it reminded me that connection sometimes comes quietly, without dramatic gestures, without confessions, only presence. We didn't talk again until he asked softly if I wanted to take a longer route tonight, just a small detour, and I nodded, surprising myself at how easy it felt to say yes, how natural it felt to let someone else guide me through unfamiliar streets, because I trusted him without explanation, because for once I didn't need to explain myself to survive, because silence had finally become a form of intimacy I could accept without fear. By the time we reached my apartment, I felt a shift, subtle but undeniable, like the air in my lungs had more space. Like the city itself had opened a small door just for me, and I realized that I didn't want the ride to end, but I also understood that endings were sometimes necessary to let the moments we wanted most actually matter, because what is treasured is never measured by repetition alone, but by the awareness we bring to it. I stepped out of the car slowly, breathing in the faint night air, and before the door closed, I turned to him and said quietly, "Thank you for driving me." And he smiled in the mirror, and in that moment, I understood that gratitude doesn't always need explanation, that sometimes saying it once is enough, and that some rides, some moments, only exist to remind us that small acts of care are enough to change everything without anyone noticing. Have you ever realized a small act of kindness quietly changed your life? The next month, I felt different before the ride even arrived, like a shift had occurred in the space between the last trip and this one, as if the city itself had learned my rhythm and waited with me. And when I stepped outside at 8:40 p.m., I felt anticipation instead of the old mix of dread and habit. And that alone surprised me because I wasn't used to looking forward to anything without caution. The car arrived on time, familiar and steady, and when I got in, I didn't sit in the back or the front. I just found a spot that felt comfortable, and he noticed without asking questions, adjusting the mirrors just slightly and starting the engine with the same quiet attention that had always made the car feel like more than transportation, like a safe space carved out for moments that existed between words, between lights, between silence. He asked if the destination had changed, and I told him it hadn't, but I added that this time I wanted to take the longer route, just a small detour through streets I knew only by memory. And he nodded, the way someone nods when they understand a request that isn't just about directions, but about wanting to feel the world differently for a few minutes, wanting the journey to be noticed. We drove through familiar streets with nothing extraordinary around us, yet it felt extraordinary because I was noticing everything. The way the streetlights flickered over wet pavement, the faint hum of tires on asphalt, the rhythm of his hands on the wheel, the way he glanced at the mirror just enough to acknowledge me without words, the world itself shrinking to the space inside this car and the space between us. Halfway through, I finally spoke, my voice quiet but deliberate, telling him about the weight I had carried in silence. About how the monthly rides had become a thread I didn't even realize I relied on, how it wasn't the destination that mattered, but the way I was allowed to exist without explanation. And when I looked at him, he said nothing, but his eyes softened, and that was enough acknowledgement for me to feel seen. Not as a patient, not as a stranger, just as someone learning how to be alive again. The city blurred past as the conversation stretched without words, stretching the space between us into something patient, intimate, safe, and when we finally approached my building, I hesitated before opening the door, realizing that I didn't want the ride to end, but also understanding that endings sometimes create the gravity that gives meaning to beginnings, and I wanted this ride, this moment, to matter. I turned to him as I unbuckled my seatbelt, feeling the hum of the car vibrate beneath us, and whispered, "I think these rides taught me more than I expected." And he smiled slightly, just a hint in the rearview mirror, not celebratory but knowing, as if he understood the unspoken truth that some connections exist, not to change your world overnight, but to remind you that it can change, quietly, steadily, without anyone noticing. I stepped out, leaving the engine running for a few moments, just to savor the pause between us, the silence that had always been shared and was now heavier with meaning. And I realized that some rides, some people, some moments aren't about repetition or routine. They're about discovery. And for the first time, I felt ready to embrace it fully. Have you ever discovered someone's presence could quietly teach you to feel alive again? The following month, I didn't hesitate to request the ride. My hand hovered over the app only briefly before tapping confirm at exactly 8:40 p.m., as if instinct had taken over, and when the car arrived, I felt a familiar warmth of expectation rather than anxiety, a fragile curiosity that had been growing quietly in the spaces between our previous trips, and for the first time I realized I looked forward to the silence almost as much as I did to the destination. I slid into the backseat automatically, the car smelling faintly of coffee and leather, the dashboard light illuminating his calm expression in the mirror, and I realized I had memorized the subtle movements of his hands on the wheel, the slight tilt of his head, the way he started the engine as if signaling the world to wait for us for this moment, for me. We moved through the city streets in habitual quiet, but this time the quiet felt loaded with intention, with an awareness neither of us needed to explain. I noticed small things I hadn't before. The way he tapped his fingers lightly on the wheel at red lights, the rhythm of the tires over uneven pavement, the soft glow of streetlights reflecting off the buildings and painting the city in streaks of gold and silver, and I felt the weight of all 12 rides settle into something more tangible, almost like a pulse I could follow. Somewhere between the third and fourth traffic light, I finally spoke. I told him I had started writing again. Not letters or journals, just small notes to myself about how the world felt when I allowed it to arrive gently, without judgment, without forcing me to perform for anyone. He didn't reply immediately, but the slightest incline of his eyebrows in the mirror told me he had heard me, that he understood without needing to say the words, and that alone made the car feel safer than any building or room I had been in recently. We drove past the corner where the bakery once stood, the one I had walked by hundreds of times in my life, but never noticed until I saw it from this seat, this perspective, this rhythm of another person guiding me through streets I'd walked alone for years. I realized then that these rides had become more than transportation. They were pauses, spaces carved out of ordinary nights where I was allowed to exist fully without explanation, without needing anyone to carry my burdens except myself and the quiet understanding of someone who had been silently present without intrusion. As the city lights blurred past, I felt a sudden urge to reach for the front of the car, to lean forward, to break the invisible wall that had existed for 12 months between us, and just as quickly I hesitated, realizing that some discoveries were meant to be savored slowly, that some connections required patience before they could be named, claimed, or spoken aloud, and that the beauty of our silence lay in the way it allowed both of us to exist without expectation. By the time we arrived at my building, I felt lighter, almost unrecognizable from the girl who had stepped into his car a year ago, carrying invisible burdens she wasn't ready to share, and yet I felt a tentative strength in knowing that I could speak without fear, that I could look into the mirror and be seen, even in the smallest gestures, and that maybe, just maybe, the next ride could be different, not because the world had changed, but because I had. Have you ever realized that silence with someone could feel more intimate than words ever could? The next ride arrived before I could overthink it, as if the city itself had remembered the pattern we had unknowingly created, and when I saw the familiar car pull up at exactly 8:40 p.m., I didn't hesitate. I opened the door and slid into the back seat, feeling the hum of the engine beneath me like a heartbeat I could trust, like the world had paused just for this moment again. He started driving immediately, the quiet between us thicker this time, weighted with anticipation and unspoken possibilities, and I found myself noticing the small details I had ignored before. The way the dashboard light reflected off his eyes in the mirror, the slight shift of his hand on the wheel, the way he seemed to navigate the city with an intimacy I had never recognized in anyone else. And I realized the city itself felt different from this seat, as though the streets, the lights, the air knew we were no longer strangers. Halfway through the drive, I let my hand brush the edge of the seat, almost instinctively, almost as if testing whether this new closeness was real. And I spoke before I could stop myself, quietly, telling him that I had been thinking about the last 12 rides and how much they had mattered to me in ways I hadn't understood until now, that they had become more than a commute. They were spaces where I had been allowed to breathe, to feel, to exist without explanation. And I felt his eyes on me in the mirror, watching, not judging, not intruding, just witnessing. He didn't say anything for several minutes, and I almost panicked, thinking my words had broken something delicate. But then he exhaled slowly and said that sometimes he drove people not because of the destination, but because the ride itself mattered, because there were moments that needed to exist without expectation. And hearing him say it aloud made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected, a mixture of relief and recognition. And I realized that we had been sharing these rides all along, quietly, without knowing it. The rest of the drive passed in a silence I no longer feared, one that felt patient, alive, intimate. And when we finally approached my building, I felt a strange reluctance to step out, a tug in my chest that whispered I wasn't ready for this to end, not yet, not when the air in the car still vibrated with something unnamed, something hovering between memory and possibility, between comfort and desire. And I understood that the ride had become a threshold, a space where the ordinary blurred into the extraordinary without needing explanation. Before opening the door, I leaned forward slightly and asked if he ever thought about what would happen if I stopped requesting rides, if he would notice the absence or simply keep driving. And he smiled faintly in the mirror and said that absence was noticed, that some patterns leave marks even when the riders vanish. And in that moment, I realized that the unspoken connection we had cultivated over a year was stronger than any conversation, more enduring than routine, more alive than expectation. I stepped out slowly, leaving the door slightly ajar, and felt a quiet certainty for the first time. Some people come into our lives not to fix us, but to show us the world from a seat we never knew we could occupy, and that sometimes the bravery lies in allowing someone to share that space, even for a moment, even without words. Have you ever shared a quiet connection that spoke louder than any words could? By the 9th month, I realized the rides had changed me more than I expected, had shifted something inside me I hadn't noticed until I felt the car arrive and my heart skipped. Not with nervousness, but with an unspoken recognition that the space between us had grown into something I wanted to protect, something I didn't want to end even if I didn't have a name for it yet. I opened the door and slid into the passenger seat without hesitation, and he acknowledged me with a quiet nod, his eyes catching mine in the mirror for a brief second that lasted longer than I expected, and I felt the familiar hum of the engine settle into a rhythm that felt like it belonged to both of us, like it was a heartbeat stretched across the months, across the quiet streets we traveled, across the soft, unspoken understanding that had become our ritual. Tonight, I decided to speak sooner, before the first traffic light, telling him about the subtle changes in my mother, about the days she remembered my name and the days she didn't, and how I had learned to carry both without breaking. And as I spoke, I felt him listen, truly listen, in a way that made the silence afterward comforting instead of empty, like he was holding the space for me without judgment, without expectation, without rushing to fix anything. He didn't respond immediately, and I almost felt guilty for filling the space, but then he said something quietly, almost as if testing the words first, that he admired the way I navigated life despite everything, that he had watched me from the seat behind him every month and seen more courage than I recognized in myself, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest, realizing that some people notice more than we ever imagine, even when words aren't shared. As the car continued through familiar streets, I felt the pull of something I'd been resisting, the desire to ask questions about him, about his life beyond the wheel, but I hesitated, knowing some things were meant to stay unknown for now, that some moments were sacred in their silence, and that curiosity didn't always need an answer to be meaningful. Near the end of the ride, I asked if he ever wondered why I came back every month, if he questioned the pattern or simply let it be, and he said he noticed. Yes, he noticed, but he understood that some habits aren't meant to be explained, that some people appear in our lives to create a rhythm that matters more than reason, and that sometimes the smallest acts, like driving someone to the same destination 12 times, can carry a weight that feels impossible to measure. When we pulled up to my building, I lingered in the car a little longer than usual, not ready to step out, not ready to let the ride end, and I realized something startling. The rides weren't about me or the destination alone. They were about the quiet trust that had grown between two strangers, about presence, about patience, about allowing someone into the rhythm of your life without asking permission. I opened the door slowly, feeling the air brush against me like a promise, and as I walked inside, I knew I wanted to see him again. Not out of necessity, not out of habit, but because for the first time, I understood that connection sometimes exists to remind us that we are alive, that we can trust, that we can open our hearts even in small, unspoken ways. Have you ever realized that someone noticing your quiet strength can mean more than any words of praise? The 12th ride came faster than I expected, and this time I didn't hesitate or debate or question whether I should request it. My finger tapped the app at exactly 8:40 p.m., and when the car arrived, I felt a rush of everything I hadn't named yet. Anticipation, fear, longing, hope, and I stepped inside as if I were stepping into the last chapter of a story I didn't want to end. He greeted me with the familiar nod, but there was something different in the way his eyes lingered in the rearview mirror, like he sensed the weight of this night, like he knew it would be more than a ride, more than routine, and I slid into the passenger seat, heart pounding, aware of how much silence could carry when it had been stretched over a year of quiet months, repeated drives, unspoken understanding. As the city blurred past, I spoke first, my voice tentative but steady, telling him that this ride would be my last, that the next month I would stop requesting the trips, that I had reached the end of the ritual I had relied on for comfort. And he said nothing at first, just kept driving with that calm attention that had always made the car feel like a shelter, a space where I could breathe without explanation. Then he asked why, softly, carefully, and I took a deep breath, looking out the window at the streetlights casting long reflections, telling him that it wasn't because I wanted to end what we had, but because some chapters need to close for the story to continue, that I couldn't keep relying on the rides as a place to exist quietly without stepping into the world fully, and that saying goodbye didn't feel like loss, it felt like courage. The silence returned, but heavier, charged with something neither of us could name yet until finally he said, "I'm glad I got to drive you." And the words were simple, but they carried the weight of months of understanding, of presence, of connection that had grown quietly between us without fanfare. And I felt a lump in my throat, realizing that the car, the streets, the rides had been a teacher, and he had been a witness. And that mattered more than I could articulate. I told him I would remember, not the rides, not the streets, not even the destination, but the way he had held space for me without asking for anything, without expecting gratitude, without breaking the silence that had become more comforting than conversation. And he nodded, as if he understood better than words could convey, and for the first time I let myself imagine that endings could feel gentle, not devastating, if they were carried this way. When the car pulled up to my building, I didn't rush out. I lingered in the seat for a moment, savoring the stillness, the shared breathing, the unspoken acknowledgement that this ride marked the close of a cycle, that we had given each other something rare without needing labels, without needing promises, without needing explanations. I opened the door slowly, stepped onto the sidewalk, and before walking inside, I said softly, "Thank you for everything." And he smiled in the mirror just once, quietly, and drove away, leaving me with a strange, luminous emptiness that was not sadness, but the weightless relief of knowing that some people appear in our lives not to stay forever, but to teach us how to trust, how to open, how to feel alive in silence. Have you ever had a farewell that felt like a gift rather than a loss?